Every single day, tens of billions of dollars worth of oil moves through one narrow strip of water. Not across oceans, not through multiple routes, just one choke point. And if something goes wrong there, the entire global economy feels it instantly. Fuel prices spike, markets react, governments panic, and suddenly, a place most people have never even heard of becomes one of the most powerful locations on Earth. This is the story of the Strait of Hormuz, the passage that quietly moves a massive share of the world's oil, and why whoever controls it controls far more than just energy. At first glance, it looks almost ordinary. Just water, ships, and coastline. No skyscrapers, no megacities. But beneath that simplicity lies one of the most critical arteries of the global economy. Every single day, around 20 million barrels of oil pass through this corridor. That's roughly 1/5 of the world's total oil consumption. One location, feeding energy into nearly every major economy on the planet. From the United States to China to Europe to India. This narrow passage keeps industries running, transportation moving, and economies alive. Without it, the world doesn't just slow down, it struggles to function. So why does so much of the world depend on this one route? The answer is geography and power. The Persian Gulf holds some of the largest oil reserves on Earth. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait and the UAE produce massive amounts of oil every single day. But here's the catch, all of that oil needs a way out, and there are very few options. The Strait of Hormuz acts like a global exit gate, a bottleneck, a pressure point. Massive oil tankers, some carrying over 2 million barrels, line up to pass through a corridor that's only about 21 miles wide, and in some sections, even narrower. This is where global supply becomes vulnerable. Now here's where it gets serious. This isn't just about oil, this is about money, at a scale most people can't even imagine. At current prices, the oil moving through this choke point represents hundreds of billions of dollars every single month. Every ship passing through is carrying economic stability, national budgets, corporate profits, entire industries. And when something disrupts this flow, even slightly, markets react instantly. Oil prices jump, shipping costs rise, insurance premiums surge. Energy companies gain or lose billions within hours. Because this isn't just a shipping route, it's a financial pipeline for the global economy. Now imagine if someone could control it, not permanently, just temporarily. That's where geopolitics comes in. The strait sits between Iran and Oman, and over the years, tensions in this region have made global headlines. Threats to block the strait, seizures of oil tankers, military patrols, naval buildups. And every time tension rises, global markets react before anything even happens. Because even the possibility of disruption is enough to shake the system. This isn't just a route, it's leverage. Now take it one step further. What happens if this choke point shuts down, even for a few days? Global oil supply drops instantly. Prices surge, 20%, 30%, or even higher. Fuel becomes more expensive worldwide. Transportation costs rise. Inflation increases. Stock markets turn volatile. And economies already under pressure start to crack. That's why major powers, especially the United States, maintain a strong naval presence in the region. Not just for defense, but to ensure one thing, that this flow never stops. There have been attempts to reduce reliance, pipelines, alternative routes, strategic reserves. But none of them fully replace this choke point, because geography doesn't change easily, and infrastructure takes years, sometimes decades to build. So for now, The global economy remains tied to this narrow strip of water. And it's not just oil. Liquefied natural gas moves through here, refined fuels, massive cargo shipments. This route connects global supply chains because if you control the flow, you influence the outcome. The Strait of Hormuz is just one example, but it reveals something much bigger. The global economy isn't just built on money, it's built on movement, and the places that control that movement quietly shape the world. Because in the end, the most powerful locations on Earth aren't the biggest or the richest, but the ones the world simply cannot afford to lose. And if you want to understand how money, power, and global control really work, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because the next story might be controlling more than you think.